So I made a video a few weeks ago that came down because it caused more questions, I think, than answers. And so I thought I'd make this video to try and answer some of your questions and queries that came from that video. So this video will be in two parts. It will be in the music, and then the second part, which will be talking about a book. I hope that part's not too boring, but the music side should be more interesting, hopefully. So, as you probably know, we are in the process of finishing the Z albums now, which is a lie. But on your side, it will look like we're finishing the Z albums now. So, what does that mean? It means that there's Z1, there's Z2, which I have over there. I just can't be bothered to go and get it. Z2, Z3, and there will be Z4 as well, which is in the works right now, almost finished right now. Should be finished in the next few days, actually. So Z1 came out last year at some point. Z2 is coming out on the 2nd of February this year. I don't want to do that side of it, but it's available on, all the normal places. And Z3 has just been mastered, and the artwork's done for that now. And Z4, we're at a stage where there's literally just a couple of songs to polish off instrumentally on my end, not on John's end, and then that will be done as well. So that's four of the Z albums there. I'm very carefully choosing my words. I'm not trying to be cryptic either, by the way, just very carefully choosing my words because I don't want to ruin things. And then there will be another album which has acoustic versions of the Z songs, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. And it has a couple of demos as well on it of songs that that didn't quite make the cut for the previous 4 albums. So let's talk about that acoustic album, because I haven't really talked about that yet. So the acoustic album is an album I've been making at the end of each of the Z albums. I've been spending a few, I don't know, like a week, taking a few of those songs and making them very different. But that's a really interesting album because it's not just like the standard acoustic stripped versions. I really wanted to take my time and think about the mindset of the albums and the book, and think about, well, if we redid those songs, how could we make them more fitting of the time period that the book takes place in, and the story in the albums. So we're using instruments that you can't just buy now. A lot of it came from, we had 2 museum pieces, guitars, still guitar, but museum pieces. We have a zither, we have double bass, but a really, that's like, is it 1890s double bass? Or is it a contrabass? I can't remember what one we have. But anyway, some really vintage instruments to do it, because I didn't just want, we did a 2-down acoustic EP recently, on Christmas Day, actually, it came out. And that was really commercial, just acoustic versions of the 2-down songs that were just the chords, and it sounded cool. But I wanted the Z ones to be dark as fuck. I want those versions to be miserable, bleak, and hard to listen to, which comes onto the book. But just to briefly go through the Z albums and the way they work. So it starts with an album called Z4. Chronologically, like story-wise, technically, it starts with an album called Z4. And then there's something else, and then we go to Z1, which is the first time we hear a man called Henry Langham. Do we hear him? I think we do. And Siegfried Engel, who are 2 characters I'll discuss later. And we hear snippets of a storyline in between songs. Now the songs in that are really important because at first glance, and this wasn't even to do with the remake, these were the original meanings behind the songs, which I've never really discussed before. And once the dust has settled on all of the albums, I will make a proper video explaining how intricately this whole process, how intricate the process has been, because there's detail in it you won't get right now, because you don't have the book, you don't know the story particularly. There's a lot of stuff that, for years I've just been sitting on, and it's just time that didn't happen anymore. There's no reason to be cryptic. I'm not being cryptic at all, but I also realise that part of the fun is experiencing it for the first time, so I don't want to ruin it now, because that would suck. So Z1 is kind of like setting the scene of what the modern storyline is. Again, is this even a useful video? It sounds so cryptic. So Henry Langham, that storyline is the modern portion of my story. There's something else that starts at Z4. It doesn't end with Z4. And that gives you a bit of architecture as to why the things are happening in Z1, 2 and 3. So let's discuss what exists now. Z1, there are songs on that, like A Drowning in Paris, which I don't think anyone's ever understood. So I'll discuss this more when I talk about the book. But there's a type of human called a mosh in my book, in my story. And that is a human who has voluntarily become part of a military exercise by a series of chemical and physical additions to his body, or her body. And for the longest time, those people just go on living their lives until one moment where they no longer have consciousness, and they become a vessel for well, it could be anyone, but in this story right now, because it gets complicated, but it could be a vessel to annihilate someone. It could be an assassination plot where a random man off the street suddenly no longer knows who he is, no longer has any recollection of his former life, and only has one soul, one purpose, which is preordained, pre-mapped to him. As pre-mapped, but also there's a book that they all carry. But that's just beyond that. So A Drowning in Paris is interesting because every country had their own mosh program, and every country titled their mosh program the capital city of that country. So a French recipient of those chemicals and that physical change would have the Parisian mosh installed into him. And Paris is a good example of the mosh system first collapsing because an external government was able to control all of France's mosh, who were basically people that were conscripted to the French army at that point to use as they would. And another country, I won't say who, got hold of... I can't say too much, shit. Another country assigned the French mosh to annihilate all other French mosh. And so there ended up being absolute chaos in France. But Paris is on fire is a very specific line, and why we call it A Drowning in Paris as well is something slightly different as well. All of these things do come to life, and I use the word life, not light. They all come to life eventually, and I hope you'll stay interested long enough for some of these things to resolve. But beyond that, so the Z1 is setting a kind of framework for how the program works, and how the story, like the architecture in which the story sits on musically. We're introduced to the lead protagonist, is he a protagonist? I don't even know. Lead character, someone called Henry Langham, who has his own very specific story within this larger story, and his is a story of loss. Lost with a question mark at the end of it. And we hear of his trials and journey to uncovering the truth about what happened to him and to the ones he loved. And for that we meet other characters, which I'll discuss in the book section of this video. But we see a real progression in terms of both the music and the story in the albums, because we go from Z1, which has music that is story setting, to Z2, which has a real personal, it feels like there are moments of complete personal affliction, as well as a bit of story maintaining in there. And then by the time we're at Z3, it's complete tragedy, personal tragedy. So we go from the largest spectrum and the largest story in Z1 to Z3, really feeling the singularity of Henry Langham and what he went through and how it ends. And it's fucking grim. It's really fucking grim. So the story, Il a Mignati, as we see in the by the way, for people who don't know, Ilya Mignati is Ilya Mignati, which you may know as something else. But those clips are literally derivations. Sorry, they are literally taken from the book. They are lines in the book. So we kind of grab them, not randomly, because we want it to make sense-ish in the storyline of the albums, but they are literally taken, you know, moments taken from, without the narrative elements, the conversations taken from directly from the book, and they become more and more unnerving, and they make more and more sense as you listen to the further albums. And we go from, at the end of Z2, they're no longer being transmissions. It becomes a genuine dialogue between two people. You feel like you're in the room with them. It's no longer the staticky transmission, because that moment changes, and Engel and Langham are in the same room, are in the same space and vicinity together, so there's no longer a need for taped. You know, there's a lot of detail that goes into when we use certain motifs like that, like the transmission-y side of things, when that's very important, because in the book they're not together until very specific points, and so I wanted that to reflect in the albums as well, because I think it could get confusing if not done like that. We don't meet her until it's over, unfortunately, but this female character called Jennifer, who is kind of the reason that that there is no closure to the storyline, I guess. So in the book, the story starts in utter chaos and it ends like that. Does it end mid-sentence? I can't remember, but it ends just like that. And it's not because I couldn't be fucked to bring an ending, it's because this book doesn't have the ending in it. You'll see. But it's quite a challenging listen, and there's an even more challenging read, because it's the albums and the book, they're not meant to be happy, they're not meant to be anything like that. They're works of art that are very stringently linked to the dark side of what I do, and I think it does that quite well in a way. So as I said, by the time we're at Z3, we're in emotional turmoil, because we've seen a man for the longest time trying to find his family, and then maybe it doesn't quite go as it should have done by the end of it. And so there's a real change in the dynamics of the music as well, because we go from Z1 and some of Z2, which has kind of epic, I'm not saying that to toot my own horn, I'm saying epic as in like they're written big choruses, you know, that kind of music, to Z3 being just so fucking heavy. It's the heaviest album I've ever written, and the vocals are well, it's interesting because, you know, I guess Z3 is the extremes of the other sounds, as in Z1 is quite uniform in terms of its aggression. You know, there are songs in there, Here in the Sky, there's songs in there that aren't quite, you know, aggressive, but it maintains a certain level. But by the time we're at Z3, that level has been scaled up so that we have really heavy elements and then really soft, mournful, melancholic elements as well. So there's a greater divide between the two genres that we're playing with there. But it is the heaviest record by far, but it also has the lightest moments as well, which is interesting. It's like a juxtaposition. But there's a real change between, you'll hear it when you know when it's coming. So there are a couple of tracks on Z3 that don't fit with the rest of Z3 because such a change has happened in the storyline that you wonder, how can this exist with the rest? But it has to be like that. When I was writing the records, I was always thinking about the book because I wrote them together. And when I reached a certain part of the book, I thought, how am I going to reflect this musically? And most of the time it was having to stop and wondering about how the character would be feeling. So there's no point in writing a heavy, disgustingly heavy moment when the character is literally crying his eyes out or something like that. And there are moments of utter venom and just absolute tragedy, but real anger and aggression as well. And that really does come through in Z3. Henry Langham's confusion and stubbornness and the fact that he's been lied to for so long. This all comes out in both in the book and in the music as such devastation, and so that was the only way to write some of those songs, was to present it like that. And then there's a moment where it just clicks and he loses everything in one moment, basically. Him and Sigrid Engel go somewhere that is deeply linked to the Z events, as well as the place that they've already been to in the Z events. Oh no, they haven't been there yet. It's the next Z event. Sorry, but they go there, and he finds something terrible, and completely falters. There is no other way to explain it. So it goes from this colossal sound to this tiny semblance of, it's like the last glimpse of hope before it turns off, and he comes to an end. It's not the end of the story, it's the end of Henry Langham. He dies. So that is not the end. A little bit more. Z4. Limb Zip. Z4 is something else. It's so much fun. It's like answering questions that have never been raised with the storyline. And it's a whole new side of the storyline that, again, has always been there, and there's always been glimpses of it, and this is going to tie up so much shit that's happened over the last 7 years. I'm really excited for it. But it's very, very different from Z1, 2 and 3. Technically, if you wanted to play them in chronological order, you would start with 4, but it's written as the 4th album, so you don't need to do that. And it is entirely narrated. The album is narrated by a single person. I won't say who, because I don't want to ruin it. But the album has amazing narration, and someone I've been wanting to work with for 8 years, something like that. So I'm really excited of the voiceover actor who's involved, because I'm like a super fan. And it really does underpin everything else. Z4 is it's kind of the first chance to understand what the fuck is going on in the storyline, because this book doesn't mention that. But we'll get on to that. So I think that's as much about the storyline of the albums as I'm going to discuss now. Z3 will be out early this year. Z4 will be out, I don't know, summer, and then the acoustic album after that. But they'll all be out obviously this year. They're all done basically. So I hope you look forward to hearing them, or if you don't look forward to them, I don't know where I was going with that. Steal them, buy them, fuck them. I don't care what you do with the records. Just try and listen to them, because a lot of work went into them, and I'm really proud of how it ended up. Oh, and the reason behind them, the reason we remade these albums is because there was such a story to tell, and I really wanted to tell it. And whether you think it's shit or great, it doesn't matter. I just really had to tell it, and I had to do it in this format, and because it's the only format I know. I'm a musician, it's what I do, and I had to relay it in this way. And now we'll move on to the book.